The Canadian Nuclear Society was formed in 1999 from the Canadian Nuclear Association. The Canadian Nuclear Association is a bunch of private companies who are there to promote the use of nuclear power. I think peaceful use of nuclear power. And the Canadian Nuclear Society split off from them, and it's more scientific, and they look at future developments, and their mission is to spread the good word for nuclear power. So I've been interested in nuclear power for a long time. I was born and raised very close to a place called Windscale in Cumbria, England, which is now called Sellafield, that has had a few issues over the years. So I've always been around nuclear power and interested in it. And I did find out some interesting things on this particular conference, which I'm going to share with you guys now. So hold on tight, admire my certificate. I really didn't know I was getting one. And let's talk about Canadian nuclear power. And American. And I'm really pleased I attended this one, and I got way more out than I was expecting. So what we had were three lecturers, two guys on the first day and a lady on the second day. And what they have is scientific backgrounds. They also had a guest lecturer there who actually came and talked to us as well, quite often, just to clarify stuff, who's also a scientist. So they're all PhD level, though I think the lady may be a master's in biology. I'm not sure, I wasn't quite listening. But the rest of them are certainly PhDs in physics and other PhDs on top of that. And they've been around and involved in the peaceful application of Canadian nuclear plants for an awful long time. And the CANDU reactor has been exploited all across the world, and Canada's a world leader in this. And I just want to give you a little bit of history and show you what we were doing. So this is the workbook we got. And as you can see, it's based on most of the slides, and I did in fact write notes. There's some interesting stuff. So the 3 units of the course are actually what is nuclear energy, and that was pretty basic, and I knew most of it, but some of it was interesting, what Canada's done, what Canada's planning to do. Issues and answers, that's more directed at if I'm asked by a member of the public, isn't nuclear power going to kill everybody and isn't it evil, I'm supposed to, having done this course, be able to answer them honestly and say, no, it's the best thing since sliced bread. We'll get into that. And the other one is radiation and risk. Radiation risk was very unfortunate. The guy that does it is actually an MD, but a research MD, and he rushed over the last slides that he had, which was about 10 of them, and that was actually the interesting part of his course, where he was supposed to talk about Fukushima and Chernobyl and other issues, and talk about what radiation risk is and how to mitigate and all that stuff. And having looked at his slides, I probably didn't miss anything by him rushing. I probably know more than he does, because a lot of these people are actually taking the viewpoint that there is no actual risk from the peaceful use of radiation. This is a good example of an early slide. As you can see, as I noted, solar is not mentioned. Solar appears to be not mentioned in most of this course, except to trash it, which is interesting. So let's cut to the chase. Oil, coal, charcoal, wood. They produce particulate matter and other chemicals that poison the water, the land, and all creatures on the planet. We all know this, but they're vastly powerful and convenient energy sources, and most people want convenience over health. Now, wind. Wind has some applications in some places, but it's variable. It's either blowing or it's not. To power a medium-sized city, you would need vast quantities of windmills, which require concrete, which is a carbon polluter, and a whole bunch of other technologies to get them going. It's never going to be the #1 or even #3 power source for humanity in the current age. Geothermal, completely not mentioned. I would have liked geothermal mentioned because I think it actually is really an attractive power source in certain places, depending on the rock formations and the ambient temperature. So why is solar vaguely mentioned? Solar is mentioned insofar as it points out that it takes huge acres of solar panels to generate power for a city. Okay, I said, so I put my hand up and said, but if you put them on existing roofs and new structures, doesn't that to a large extent mitigate the area size? You can't do that with windmills, you really can't. But you can with solar panels. So then later on they came up with the objection that most solar panels only last 5 to 10 years and are full of heavy metals, and there is no plan to deal with those heavy metals in solar panels. Environment Canada were also attending this, with which I was grateful. Environment Canada pointed out that most solar panels now last 25 years and drop to 95% efficiency of their original starting efficiency, which is about 40 to 45%, and I'm sitting there thinking, I don't really think you have a good plan to deal with nuclear waste either. And if you're going to bury these heavy metal solar panels underground, you might be able to do that a lot cheaper and easier and safer than burying radioactive inotropes. That's just me. So that's another case. We need energy. The more energy we have, the richer we are. Therefore, the better our standard of living. There was a discussion about what that actually means, and I think that's a reasonable discussion. Just because you have more money and more wealth and you're using more products doesn't necessarily mean you're a happier, more enjoyable lifestyle. Not necessarily, to some degree. But when they're talking about the use of energy, they were talking about how great energy is, but didn't mention any of the side effects of modern energy. Inequity, pollution. I could go on at length. I'll show you the slide. There you go, you can see my little notes on this, you can see what they were saying. There is no case at all, except in very radical green, to actually dismantle all of modern society and go back to living in mud huts. The real question is what's going to produce the energy we need for lights and everything else once fossil fuels are no longer used because of cost, actual price, or because of their actual bad effects. We've now got almost over 6 million people a year on the planet Earth dying from the effects of burning fossil fuels. This isn't rubbish, they say this as well. And that number's getting worse and worse and worse. And how many children now have asthma? And they don't have asthma because they're eating different types of cereals or Monsanto's evil, though I'd like to believe that. But really most of the children who are having asthma is because they're breathing in particulate matter in urban areas. Not all of them, but a lot of them. You can see from this one, I wrote quite a bit on it. Basically what they're claiming here is that we need more energy for the bigger population and to have a higher lifestyle. There was no discussion, there was no thought given to, can we actually manage in a humane and ethical way a reduction in human population, so therefore we can use more energy per person, but maybe use less as a species. Zero discussion on that, as per usual. Now I've said before, I'll say again, Canadians are power pigs, simple as that. We even make the Americans look fairly good. This is the energy consumption by sector in Canada. As you can see, transportation is by far the biggest sector and probably will remain so for a long time. As of now, we don't have decent electrical powered vehicles and certainly don't have decent electrical powered lorries and trains to actually transport the volume of goods that we require to maintain our current society. That hopefully will change over the next few years. Certainly if we were investing in much in that as we are in nuclear power, I would argue we'd probably be a long way along the road to that. Now along with car ownership, computer ownership, cell phone ownership and various other things like meat consumption, we are now at a tipping point. The tipping point has been reached. The rich people, the lucky few in the West, are now using as a percentage of energy on the planet less than the unlucky people who have terrible poor lifestyles, the people who don't live in the technical West. The reason they're using more power than us now is because there's so many more of them. On an individual per capita, per person level, they are still and remain using far less than us. But what they are doing is they're using more and more energy per capita. Whereas most countries of the West, with some exceptions, USA, are actually using less and less energy. We're being more efficient with the energy we use, which is always a good idea considering there are wastes with all energy and there are costs with all energy. So there was zero talk about how to actually make more energy more efficient in Canada. There was no discussion about passive homes, there was no discussion about hubs for solar energy and wind energy and geothermal energy, there was no discussion about altering where people live to make them closer to work rather than far away from work because it's cheaper in the periphery. Now this is being done by scientists, right, physicists. Now as I pointed out, solar energy is nuclear energy, it comes from the sun. All energy on Earth derives from the sun in some form or other, except for perhaps geothermal, though there is an argument that geothermal came from the sun when the Earth coalesced, but not necessarily. Magnetic and tidal and pressure forces are actually what is generating a lot of the heat of geothermal energy, so that would be an argument for something that's possibly not solar, but then you could argue that the atoms of the materials involved inside the Earth are actually all from stars, so it is ultimately solar. So electrical use since 1971 has basically doubled in percentage terms across the planet Earth. It's much more than doubled in amount. But what is interesting with that is that the bottom line here is that energy remains for most of us a monopoly supplied industry. So there's a huge industry involved in creating national grids, there's a huge industry involved in providing power plants, there's a huge industry involved in charging the individual consumer for the use of the electricity. So anything that's going to rattle business normal, Uber if you like in terms of power, is going to be looked upon dimly by the electrical power companies. And the electrical power companies, by and large, are completely owning nuclear power. Now, nuclear power in Canada has about a 60,000 person workforce and is very well spread out across the country, except it isn't. Only the provinces of Ontario and New Brunswick maintain currently operating power plants. Quebec had a really nice one that they closed down politically because they decided it wasn't worth poisoning their water supply if something went wrong. And Alberta refused to have them. There was some discussion about nuclear power being used to extract the tar sands because then you wouldn't use half a barrel of oil, clean oil, to get 1 barrel of dirty oil. But that's a whole different discussion. But anyway, as it stands, only Ontario and New Brunswick are using nuclear power in all of Canada. America has got much more infiltration into their power grids from nuclear power than we do. They're using a different type of reactor down there as well. They're using a light water reactor, whereas we're using the CANDU reactor. We believe, we were told, that they have some advantages to CANDU compared to American light water reactor systems. I'm not going to get too heavy technical in that. The bottom line is, it sounded reasonable to me, but how do I know? These people are sort of biased into seeing CANDU as better than light water reactor. Now, when electricity goes through any system, currently a national grid, which isn't national, it's a transnational grid. I believe it affects Mexico as well, but it definitely is entwined between Canada and America. That power generation has to be 100% of maximum usage, or you need to be firing up extra power very quickly at times of use. You can't afford to have the actual voltages dropping throughout the system at any time, or you cause terrible damage. So their argument is that nuclear power is the clean way, the efficient way, the green way to provide most of that power, and then use supplementary liquid gas power stations for peak demand, with some hydro, with some wind. Barely mentioned solar. I don't think they like solar. The problem with hydro in Canada is that we don't really want to dam any more rivers. It causes a terrible amount of damage to the environment of the river system, and we're not really keen on doing that. And all of the easily and cheaply available rivers to dam have pretty much been dammed, like Niagara Falls. Now, with increased human usage and various climate changes, the ability to dam rivers to provide electrical power over the world, generally speaking, is much less than it ever was. About 62% of all electricity generated in Ontario is nuclear power. All of my electricity generated is actually green renewable energy. I pay a supplement for that. But most people won't, and most people don't. But 62% is quite a lot. And their argument is that that model, the Ontario model, would be best spread throughout all of Canada and the rest of the world. Whereas the bottom line is, nuclear power, when they start a process, when they start a plant, has to actually put money aside for both the decommissioning of the plant and also for dealing with the waste. Currently, I was told they estimate there's 19 billion put aside for this. 9 billion for decommissioning and 10 billion for dealing with waste. That's not enough money if we have a Fukushima incident in a nuclear power station in Ontario or New Brunswick or the United States. Their argument is that safety is becoming more and more a thing in the nuclear industry and it won't happen. I find that hard to believe, and I'll tell you why. Their argument is that the risk industry for nuclear power is 1 in a million. So one of the things they said to us, if there's 10 doors and behind 9 doors is $1 million in cash for you and behind one door there's a guy with a gun who will shoot you dead, would you open the doors? Now, a surprising number of people in the room said yes to 1 in 10 odds of death. When it got to the 1 in a million, I was the only person left in the room that said no. And I'll explain why. The existential risk of extinction, death, compared to the possible joy of getting $1 million, the odds are always there that I might die. And I really like being alive, and I'm not going to risk my life to get $1 million. These people seem to think that's a fair transaction. 1 in a million risk is fine. I don't agree. They also said that over 17,000 years of cumulative nuclear power running, there's only been 2-3 major industry issues. Chernobyl, of course, and Fukushima, and they offered quite outstandingly low death rates for both of those, and they made some claims that have been debunked by quite a few people, so that's not going to work as an argument. Anyhow, that's going to be in the second video, because this is going to have to be a two-parter. There's quite a lot of detail on how we mine uranium and how it's all very safe and everything else. That was kind of fun. Kind of enjoyed that. Taught me a lot of things about uranium mining I did not know, and now I know. So the CANDU reactors in Canada use non-enriched uranium, and they explain quite a bit about what that means. Pretty much all of the American reactors use enriched uranium. Their argument is that that costs far, far more for the fuel, although the fuel costs of nuclear power plants are actually very, very small compared to the rest of the fixed costs. But they also were implying that that's more of a dangerous thing to do. So I got to hold some uranium fuel pellets, and I got to hold a CANDU fuel bundle, and I got to hold some of the rods. So you can see those pictures, they were kind of fun. I would point out that they're actually mock-ups and they're not actually radioactive. One of the interesting things, and I really like how they put this, they said that the CANDU fuel bundle 200 years after extraction from the power station is actually something you can stand next to for a brief period of time and have no bad benefits from it in 200 years. But then when you look at how much fuel rods we're actually producing, and we're producing an enormous amount. Each of the CANDU reactors has 380 to 480 pressured rods inside it, and each of them have 6 CANDU fuel bundles. Now I'll show you the fuel bundle again. It weighs 49.5 kilograms fully loaded, because above 50 kilograms you're not allowed to lift it on your own in Canada, health and safety, so they designed it to be able to be lifted by one person. So I think you can kind of figure out here we're generating a lot of waste, a lot of high radioactive waste. Very few of the percentage of that waste, it's about 3% of the actual waste, is high waste. So they use that as an example of why the nuclear power is fine. But any percentage of radioactive waste that can kill you dead if you're in the room with it in 20,000 years is going to be a disposal problem. Now we could send it to the Philippines and hope they don't notice, but technically what we're doing is we're storing it on site. We're trying to build a deep depository, a geological safe depository, and hopefully we can get going on that soon. I think of all the things we do, that's a good idea. We've got 3 sites now in Canada, and there's 5 Inuit and First Nations communities looking to have one of those 3 sites built in its neighbourhood, and that's why half of the people at this conference were actually First Nations. They're being funded by the federal government and nuclear power companies to actually come and attend stuff like this, to go back to their reserves and be ambassadors for nuclear power. See, I don't think it helps them to do stuff like this. I really don't. When you are talking about this and you just deliberately don't mention solar power whatsoever, cynics like me are always going to say, why not? Why not? Solar power cannot replicate how we power our homes and our businesses and our cars in 2019. What it can do is substantially reduce the amount of nuclear and backup power generation that's required. It also, if used properly, cuts out the monopoly electric supplier and makes the home owner or the business owner independent most of the time for electrical power use, and maybe even can sell some in a grid form to other people. So I understand why they don't like solar, because solar I think is actually the direct competitor of nuclear. Fossil fuels and coal powered stations, except in the heads of insane people, really need to be shut down. We all know that. Liquid natural gas may need to be kept going for occasional power boosts if we can't figure out other ways of doing that, i.e. lifting water when we have high production but low use, and then letting the water down to drive turbines when we have more power required than we can produce. So there's various things we can do. We're not doing any of it. What we're doing in Canada is spending a huge amount of money on nuclear power. Anyway, one bundle of the CANDU is actually 100 years worth of power for me and Kitty, not 1 year. But even so, there's a lot of me and Kitties in Canada. There's about 38 million people in Canada. The fact that each bundle lasts between 2 months and 18 months in the reactor before it needs to be replaced. And in Canada we don't reprocess nuclear fuel. And I used to live near Sellafield previously called Windscale, and I think it's a good job we don't. Reprocessing nuclear fuel does increase the life of the fuel cell, but also produces some really, really nasty byproducts. So each CANDU reactor produces about 16 waste bundles a day. And I'm going to hold it here. The next video is going to talk a lot more about actual safety at nuclear plants and the implications of that. And it's also going to talk about some of the interesting ideas I came up with from the conference and the course about how to mitigate risks for me and for you if one of these unsinkable plants sinks. And remember, always be skeptical about everything. And I'm not going to say right now what I think about nuclear power. I'm not going to say what I think we should do in terms of energy in Canada and America. It's really controversial, but I will definitely be addressing that in the next video, or the one after that. This could be a three-parter. I hope not. Thanks for your patience. Have a great day. Toodles. This is just some pictures of the food I got. It was the best conference I've been to for food. Breakfast I was a bit limited. I could only get home fries and ketchup, and the bread was not vegan. But then I figured out how to use the hotel to get fruit and regular bread, so I did that the next day. They also gave me some great food. The first day was spicy stir fry, really good, vegan. And the next day I had a noodle, which was spicy, but not quite as spicy as the day before, with garlic bread. And it was kind of nice because most of the buffet food they provided actually was vegan, but they went out of their way to give me vegan food, which I appreciated.